Good morning, warriors. I hope you guys are doing all right. Um, I'm ready to go the social distance and keep myself kind of at home as much as possible over the next 10 to 14 days or until otherwise specified. I hope you guys are the same. I also want you guys to know that if you are feeling super isolated or if you just need to talk to somebody, um, uh, social distancing shouldn't be something where you just kind of like hole up in your room. It should also be something where it's absolutely fine for you to chat on the phone with people or set up Skype calls if that's a thing that y'all do, or you can always talk to me. Remember that your office hours for this class are going to be from 10:30 to 12 p.m. every day. So at the bottom of every post, you will find that I have an embedded YouTube video, and you're welcome to ask me any questions about topics that you didn't fully understand, or if you are having technology problems, I can help you out there, or anything else. I just want you guys to have a chance to chat a little bit, even though we're trying to do the best we can for our neighbors and stop the spread of a virus. So let's go ahead and get started. So over the past several days in class, we've been working through material on the history of Nigeria. I'm so sorry. I've got like a little bit of a hiccup and it's driving me nuts right now. So we've been working on the history of Nigeria, and you guys worked through a sway on that's also posted on the blog. You can go back a couple of days and find it. That addressed essentially history of the Nigerian region from the time of the Bantu migration all the way up to late stage imperialism. And today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about the process of Nigeria's movement towards independence, and what the early Nigerian Republic looked like and what it looks like today. So let's go ahead and get started. So there we go. So as you might imagine, British imperialism in Nigeria was long-standing and economically driven, and from basically 1885 up until the end of World War II, the British really controlled the Nigerian territory. Through intermediaries. They frequently used people of high leadership status within either what was then the Sokoto Caliphate or the Oyo Empire as sort of emissaries. And they did this through a system of clientelism, where local leaders would be rewarded for working with the British, and those working against the British would be punished. This established essentially a hierarchy within the colonial system of people who benefited from British rule and people who did not. But what we see is that World War II kind of changes the question of imperialism altogether, because one of the central tenets to British participation in World War II was the notion of self-determination. In 1941, the British signed something called the Atlantic Charter with the United States, and the Atlantic Charter was this document saying that all people around the world had the right to self-determination, which means that they should have the right to choose the kind of government they want. Now, Britain issued the Atlantic Charter with the notion that they were talking about places like Poland, where the Nazis had invaded, or they were talking about places like China, where the Japanese were occupying territory. They did not necessarily think that this was an idea that was going to be applied to Britain's many, many colonies, but it definitely was. So what you see is following World War II, there are a number of significant civil society organizations that start to develop in the Nigerian colony. The first is the National Council of Nigerian Citizens, the NCNC. Now, this one is going to be very important later on, so you should definitely know about it. And again, I'm going to apologize for butchering pronunciations. I'm just going to try my very best, and you're just going to have to forgive me when I get it wrong. Initially, the NCNC, its membership was primarily targeted to Igbo populations who lived in the south of the Nigerian colony, near the Niger River Delta and kind of a little bit west of that. It was founded by a particular Igbo politician whose name, he was also a teacher actually, his name was Benjamin Nnamdi Ezekwe, and he was a journalist. He'd been educated in the United States, and so had been kind of exposed to the idea of the importance of political organization, of a free press, and also about the idea that what was really important was giving people a chance to organize effectively. So the NCNC was one of these first civil society organizations that developed post-World War II. Another one was the NPC, the Northern People's Congress, not non-playable character. That's different. This was primarily a group that was organized by Hausa Muslims. Remember, we talked about the Hausa. The Hausa are an ethno-linguistic group up in the north of Nigeria, and that population is majority Muslim. The AGP, the Action Group Party, was another civil society organization that was pro-nationalist and essentially pro-independence, and this was a primarily Yoruba group. So the British initially tried to handle the development of these civil society organizations, which were, all of them, all three of these major organizations were arguing in favor of increased domestic liberties, increased freedom for Nigerians to determine how they wanted to rule their own country. And so the British tried to handle this by adopting a system of decentralized federalism. What they meant by this was that they devolved power to a local level in a lot of cases. What this did was it essentially kind of it broke up power around Nigeria, and it said that, okay, in the north where the Sokoto Caliphate was, it actually still existed, but it really wasn't powerful by the 1940s, 1950s. They get to choose how they want to rule themselves. Down in the southeast, the Yoruba populations can decide how they want to rule themselves. Igbo areas have some degree of self-governance as well. And the British were doing this, first of all, I mean, you could make the argument that it was an increased democratic movement by moving power closer to the people, but it also tended to kind of break up the possibility of full independence. If you give people a little bit more power locally, then maybe they won't rebel against the empire altogether. So what you saw was a really interesting trend. You saw this rise in nationalism where they had that idea of their own sovereign political destiny, but it was also a very regional sort of nationalism. Like Igbo views of what Nigeria should be were massively different from what Hausa views of what Nigeria should be. And so during the 1950s, what you have are these autonomous regions being developed, primarily in the north, the west, and the east. Now, ultimately, by the middle of the 1950s, it became pretty clear that the British Empire was going to have to make some concessions to independence. So the goal by the late 1950s was to help Nigeria to transition to independence while maintaining the relationship of Nigeria to the British Empire through the British Commonwealth. So, before full independence was granted by the British Empire, there were plans that were put in place. The British worked to kind of create a system of transition to full Nigerian independence. And this initial system was based on a federal structure. Now, remember, federal systems reserve powers constitutionally or through law for local or regional governments. So this federal structure was made to kind of recognize the diversity of populations and the diversity of government systems that already existed in the Nigerian colony. So initially there were only three regions created. Think of them like three giant provinces, the northern, western, and eastern provinces. And if you look at a map of Nigeria, you'll see that essentially the arc of the Niger River, it joins onto another river. I believe it's the Benue, but I'm doing this without a map in front of me right now. And that kind of neatly divides the country into thirds. And that's where those regions are. The west is kind of west of the Niger and south of the northern arc of the Niger. The northern is to the north of that. It's pretty straightforward. So the goal was to create this federal structure with a House of Representatives, a Senate, and that you would have these regional assemblies that would elect the senators. So it would be sort of like the U.S. system prior to the direct election of senators. Now, initially when the negotiations for Nigerian independence were taking place, the assumption was that there needed to be kind of these strong connections to the mother country, and they set up the deal ahead of time to figure out who was going to be the representative to the crown, and that ultimately was Benjamin Ezekwe. He became the governor general and became essentially the person who shepherds Nigeria into independence. So, once the structure of the new Nigerian state was established, then Nigeria was granted its independence. It was a signing ceremony, and it took place on October 1st, 1960, and this establishes the First Republic, okay? Now, the fact that I'm calling it the First Republic should indicate to you that there are going to be problems with this. But what you should know is that the actual initial transition to independence for Nigeria was relatively peaceful. There were definitely incidents of violence in some places, but it isn't as though Nigeria held a war for independence. It was a much more bureaucratic process of transition than, say, what happened in Algeria. Algeria, if you are unfamiliar, fought a bloody, bloody war for independence against France for a long time, and it was really brutal. Nigeria didn't go through that. So initially, this right here is what Nigeria looked like at its moment of independence in 1960. And what you'll notice is here the northern region is massive. It's huge. But these are the populations. We're looking at 16.8 million people here in the northern region, and 6.4 million people in the western, and 7.2 in the eastern region. Now, what you will also notice is that there's a separate little region here for Lagos. Lagos was the federal capital of the First Republic. It is no longer the capital of Nigeria. It is the colonial capital of Nigeria, and it's a very, very, very big city. It's economically the capital of Nigeria, but it's not where government happens anymore. So one thing you have to remember is kind of the broad makeup of these regions. Over here in the northern region, we're mostly talking Muslim population, largely Hausa, Fulani. And then over here in the western region, this is Yoruba land. This is where people are mostly Yoruba. And down here, this is largely Igbo populations. Now, obviously, there are tons of other ethno-linguistic groups in this region, but that's kind of the breakdown. Okay, so this is the actual signing ceremony for the independence of Nigeria. This is October 1st of 1960. Now, during this initial period of independence, there were a lot of positives. So Nigeria's system was going to be federal with some powers reserved for the regional levels and municipal levels. But broadly, even though they talked about a House and a Senate, this was still going to be a parliamentary system on the British model, which made sense because that's what the colonial structure had been. So it was what people were used to. Initially, there were quite a lot of positives for Nigeria. Nigeria looked like it was getting off on the right foot. It had many, many things going for it. There was the potential for industrialization. Nigeria has oil reserves that had recently been discovered. It had really strong exports, actually, as of 1960, particularly as in the agricultural sector. And that oil revenue, people thought, could be plowed into things like infrastructure and educational structures. But there were some early indications that not all was going to go well, because in the 1959 parliamentary elections that were held prior to the movement, not the movement for independence, but the actual signing of the independence document, the NPC, that civil society organization that has now transitioned into becoming a political party, which was largely backed by the Hausa, won half of the seats in the House. And they formed a coalition with Igbo populations. So the Hausa were mostly Muslim, and the Igbo were mostly Christian, which might seem like a bit of an odd combination, a odd allyship. However, they were essentially allying against Yoruba populations, some of which are Christian, but a minority of which still practice polytheistic beliefs, and therefore are kind of like outside of the system that the NPC or the NCNC would be willing to kind of back. They also had different regional interests. The AGP, the Yoruba group, fragmented. There were internal disputes, and ultimately this led to fighting in the western region. The fighting got so bad in the western region that the central government had to establish emergency rule because they were afraid that the fighting would spread to the capital city of Lagos. I'm going to stop this video here because I only have 15 minutes recording time, and then I'll pick up in a moment.